the number one thing that a leader can learn from like watching and engaging with pop culture is probably how to manage relationships. A lot of times when we think about managing relationships, and especially in my like executive coaching work, I see this a lot where a manager or leader will say something like, well, what does that look like? And I'll be like, well, you need to communicate more clearly. Well, okay, what does that look like? And you can use examples in pop culture to kind of illustrate that. So, for example, at the end of the Avengers movie, when Captain America is giving instructions, he has very clear instructions about what he wants every person to do, what he wants everybody in his team to do, and then he has these clear follow-ups. And so that helps, for leaders to see like, oh yeah, I can totally see this. I can totally understand, how this might work.
Are you a fan of the Marvel comics and or the movies? If not, then full disclosure, this may not be the best episode for you. Do stick around anyway, because there are still some useful and worthwhile leadership lessons to hear in today's episode. Now, this won't be the first time that I've talked leadership through the lens of popular culture. Longtime fans may recall episode 44 from last year, when I interviewed the host of the Star Trek Leadership Academy, Jeff Aiken, about the many leadership stories of the Star Trek universe. And today I'm joined by Dr. Sai Islam, who is, among other things, co-author of the book Leaders Assemble, Leadership Lessons from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So we'll be talking about the book, what we can take from the MCU and the Marvel heroes and apply to our own leadership at work. There's also a bit of mild debate about who's the best leader in the Marvel universe and a few more key topics today as well around leadership, management, and what makes a good leader. Sai is also co-founder of a talent consulting business. He's a university professor and an expert in industrial organizational psychology. So I've no doubt we'll be getting into the depth of these important topics and not just talking about superheroes for a few hours. It won't be a few hours, although there's definitely going to be a bit of talking about superheroes. Either way, I hope you enjoy this one. And don't forget, stick around to the end of the episode for details on how to learn more, how to get copies of Sai's books, as well as your exclusive listener-only discount to join my Integrity Leaders online community for half price forever.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Sai, welcome onto Leading with Integrity. It's great to have you on the show. We've got quite a new, I think, perspective on leadership from you today that I'm really looking forward to getting into.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I do enjoy bringing a new, possibly extremely nerdy view to leadership. So
I'm here for it, definitely. So before we get into that, let's kick off really by over to you. Tell the listeners a bit about yourself, your background, your career so far, your business, and what you get up to today.
Sure. So my name is Sai Islam. I am the vice president of consulting for a boutique consulting firm called Talent Metrics. And I'm also an associate professor of psychology at Farmingdale State College here in the United States, out in Long Island. Which is in New York. And my background is I've got a PhD in an area called applied organizational psychology. In Europe, it's referred to as work psychology, which I think is a much better name and makes more sense. In the United States, people were very confused, my parents included, about like what does an industrial organizational psychologist do? In Europe, you tell people work psychologist, they're like, oh, I immediately understand that. And so some of my research is in leadership. My consulting work is in leadership development, leadership assessment. My company works in a couple of different areas. Primarily, we do outsourced people analytics. So if you're small to medium-sized business or a very large organization that's looking to do a bespoke project, we'll help you to use your data to derive insights about what your business is doing in terms of its people processes. We also help build what are called customized assessments for organizations. Usually those assessments are pre-hire assessments. So if you want to find out, for example, you want to create some sort of assessment or test for, an employee in customer service, we would design and develop something specific to your organization for that. And then that third area is in training and development, which is where I started my career before I did a PhD. I worked in recruitment and training and development. It's kind of like my first big love is training and development. That's partly why I got into higher education and into teaching. I love watching students, employees develop and grow and develop those skills, especially around skills like leadership or management. So that's a little bit about me.
And I don't think you mentioned the book, so I'm going to ask about that next. So it's called Leaders Assemble, I think. And I'd love to hear a bit about the book itself and the story behind why you decided to write it.
Yeah, so Leaders Assemble, Leadership of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's a subtitle. It just rolls off the tongue. That started because my co-author, Dr. Gordon Schmidt, from the University of Louisiana Monroe, we're good friends. We're both huge nerds, and in our teaching and in our training work, in leader development, we were using pop culture quite often, especially the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We were using examples from Captain America or Iron Man or Spider-Man, using those in class. And part of the reason for that is because, especially if you're teaching university students, and university in the United States, I think, means something a little bit different than in the UK, but it's mostly 18 to 22-year-old undergraduates, or even if you're teaching master's level courses for MBA students and things like that, they're usually 25 and up. Sometimes they don't know enough to understand some of the leadership concepts, especially for my undergraduate students. They've never worked in an office before. They've had jobs, but they've been primarily things like, being a server in a restaurant or being a delivery driver or something that maybe they perceive as not having leadership components to it, or the leadership experience they've gotten has been a manager scheduling them for a particular task. And, the way that we define leadership in the book is it's a social process where we try to influence one another. And that's something that you can see in pop culture. And so one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing is we would curate clips with one another, and we would share ideas about, you should use this scene from, Avengers, or you should talk about this scene about conflict management. And after we'd gone through talking about that and sharing those ideas, Gordon had found a call for book proposals from Emerald Publishing, which is a big academic publisher based out of the UK. And they were looking for proposals that used pop culture of different kinds to explore leadership concepts. So they have a book about leadership in Star Wars, if you like that, leadership in Harry Potter. They've got one about leadership and Doctor Who, which, I kind of wish I'd written that one. I love Doctor Who. So, but these are all really cool, exciting, fun books, and really fun way of engaging with different types of leadership theories. And so we ended up putting together a book proposal. We submitted it, they accepted it, and we ended up writing this book. It was an excuse for me to rewatch all the Marvel movies without complaint from my wife. So she couldn't be like, "Oh, you're wasting your time watching Marvel movies." And I was like, no, this is work now. So that was a lot of fun. And it was really cool because it was a new lens through which to look at and watch these movies and to kind of critically think about, well, okay, what does it take to show leadership in these films? And in addition to being a great way for students to look at it, for leaders, when I do executive coaching work or when I'm doing leadership development, it's easy for people to kind of watch a scene with movie characters and say, oh, there's the leadership problem. I can identify the mistake that's being made. I can see what's happening because there's a layer of unreality. Whereas if you ask them to think about, well, talk about your own leadership skills or your own manager, there's a lot of emotions there, and there's a lot of pushback. And they say, "Oh, my manager just hates me. That's why they're a terrible manager," and that may or may not be true. But if you ask them to think about a situation from a movie or a TV show and then bring it back to their own experience, that can create enough of a space for them to reconsider what they've been doing. So that's how it's been useful for us in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I must say I do love the whole popular culture angle on it, because it's something that's so relatable, isn't it? I mean, particularly things like Marvel and Star Wars, Star Trek, things that most, I think they're more mainstream than they used to be, but most of us have grown up with these stories, and so you don't have to put too much thought into it to be able to relate it, I think, to your own experience, and then suddenly it makes what could be quite an abstract and difficult theory or concept make sense quite easily, in my experience anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very funny for me, like growing up in like the 80s and 90s as a huge nerd. It's very funny to me to watch like people that I knew in high school and elementary school who were like made fun of me for liking Marvel or liking any of the nerdy stuff. And then now it's like every pop culture thing is stuff that I grew up reading. Like, what is it? Game of Thrones is like one of the biggest shows. Lord of the Rings is a huge movie series. And those are the things that in high school or middle school, people were like, "Oh, you read this stuff, you like this stuff, what a nerd." And now everything is all of that. And so it's cool that that's there and that we can do so much with those stories, because they're very good stories. And we know that like we spend so much time taking like English lit courses, thinking about what stories mean. And now we can bring this other lens to it and say, well, what are some lessons that we can take from these types of stories?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, the number of times that I wished I didn't have to read like Pride and Prejudice or Macbeth or something, and I could have been looking at a Marvel comic or something like that instead. Because really, I mean, the stories are just as powerful. I think the only difference is they're easier to understand and they're more enjoyable to read. Again, I'm probably biased, and I'm sure any English lit major in the audience is going to be writing a strongly worded email as we speak. But, that's the way I see it anyway.
You don't have Spider-Man without Hamlet, right? That's the email you're going to get, right? It's possible. It's definitely possible. Yeah. And they each achieve, the goals that they set forward. There are different ways of engaging with that stuff. And it's really cool to kind of look at it from that perspective.
Definitely. So this, I think, may be the most difficult question of the whole episode. I don't know. I think it is for me. It probably isn't for you. Mm. Which of the Avengers is the best leader in your view?
All right. So I actually have, I've thought about this a lot, and I have a personal favorite. I don't know if he's the best. I do, I think that out of everybody, I think he shows maybe the signs of being a leader that is, I think maybe the best. But this also, I might be biased because I really love this character in the comics, and that's the Black Panther, T'Challa. And the thing that I think he does that I think sets him apart from other leaders in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is he's able to, not only does he like manage a country, he does a good job of like managing tasks, which is, I think, really important. Sometimes we tend to think of leaders as like, oh, we're going to be buddy. It's all relationship based. But if you're not getting the work done, if you're not completing the work, you're not a good leader, right? Like if your team doesn't like get the work done, you're not a good leader. I don't know if you've seen the show Ted Lasso at all. So in that show, there's like a big conflict between Ted and his his friend who's also a coach, and Ted's like, I don't really care about wins or losses. Like, my man, you're coaching a soccer team. You gotta win. You can't just be like, everybody's giving hugs to one another and that'll get the job done. You have to get the work done. And so the Black Panther is able to do that. He manages a country, he manages a team, he assigns tasks, but he's able to handle those relationships really, really well. And not only does he handle relationships with people who agree with him, but he handles relationships with people who disagree with him very, very well. And he's able to do something that a lot of superheroes aren't able to do, and that's he's able to take those people that are opposed to him and he brings them into the fold. So in the Black Panther film, There's a character named M'Baku that he fights in the beginning. He battles him for like the throne of Wakanda. By the end of the movie, he's brought this guy to his side, and he's getting support and help from him. And you kind of wish leaders could do that, especially in the corporate world, that, you know, people didn't look at things as a zero-sum game and could say, well, okay, I know we had this conflict, but we have shared goals, we have shared organizational goals, let's work together, let's resolve that conflict. And you even see that in Black Panther's first appearance in Captain America Civil War, where his father is killed by a villain, and he has the opportunity to kill that villain, a character named Baron Zemo. And he says, I'm not going to do that because, you know, that's revenge. That's not going to help me. Maybe there's something you can offer. And there's like a huge gap between how we usually think about leadership, which is, oh, it's a zero-sum game. My team's got to win. I have to not only dominate, not only do I have to like be in charge, but I have to remove all opposition, which is sort of something you see in Game of Thrones, where you cannot have any opposition. You've got to take out anybody that opposes you. But he's able to kind of do that. There are other leaders that I think strive for that in some ways, like Tony Stark and Captain America. But I think the Black Panther does that the best.
It's a good answer. I can't disagree with anything you say. I think what I've also find interesting about the culture as well of Wakanda and the way Black Panther comes into being, there's that royalty aspect to it as well. Mm-hmm. And you kind of wonder, comparing him against some of the other characters, whether it's necessarily fair, because he would have been prepared for his whole life for that role, whereas a lot of the others are just sort of thrown in the deep end at, a day's notice or whatever.
Oh yeah, that's definitely part of it, yeah. Right? He's been mentored, and he's learned under another king. He knows what the role really is, and that's also interesting because how many leaders have we seen that end up in managerial jobs and they're really not prepared for it? A lot of times in organizations, what I've seen is you could be like very technically competent, right? I see this in a lot of engineering companies where they have an engineer that's really good, and they're like, well, you're so good that let's move you into a managerial role. And so, nobody looks at LeBron James and they're like, you shouldn't be on the basketball court anymore. You should really be on the bench and coaching the other players. That would be ridiculous. Like everyone would think that was nuts, but that happens in organizations and companies all the time. So I think that's definitely part of it. I think certainly some elements of leadership are innate. Some of it is like skill based, and it's about a certain level of talent. But you can also learn and help scale people's capabilities up through like learning. You can develop those skills and capabilities.
So that's kind of what I was alluding to in terms of, I guess it's a country, not an organization, but that cultural, the kind of the preparation for the role before you have to do the role. And there's such a big parallel there to leaders and this accidental manager problem that you just described. And it's funny, isn't it? Engineers is a good one. Salespeople is another one. That top performer, they're singled out and given the leadership role, and nobody thinks, well, actually, are they any good with people? A lot of engineers who are really good at engineering are rubbish with people, aren't they? In my experience. That's why the sales one is it's almost a paradox, isn't it? Because to be good at sales, you've got to be good with people. And yet, how many salespeople who are promoted to sales manager make rubbish managers? It's a weird one.
It is weird, but sometimes the things that, like a salesperson, some of the things that they kind of innately know are hard to articulate to somebody else, right? Like, the example that I always think about is Michael Jordan is greatest basketball player of all time, but he's an absolutely garbage basketball executive. Every place that he's like been in charge, he hasn't done well because it's hard to communicate being the greatest of all time. Like, what am I going to do? Like, hey, your fast twitch muscles are not moving fast enough to respond to this. Like, you can't do anything about that. There's nothing there. And so I think that happens with salespeople as well. And, maybe they have some of those skills, but they don't know how to redirect those sales capabilities, those relationship building skills into a leadership relationship, because they're used to, I'm maintaining this relationship with a client. The client is, has purchased something, and then I hand them off, and then I don't have to think about them anymore because That's the relationship I understand. Whereas if you are a leader, you're not shuttling people off to go wherever. They're going to be with you consistently for, in some cases, years, and you have to manage and figure out how to like deal with conflict, deal with maybe disappointment, providing disappointing information to people in that context, and it's really hard to do. Whereas if you're a salesperson, you're like, well, this is what the product offers, this is what we can do. You can pawn some of that off to other people in a different way. And you don't have to deal with them every day, right? Customers are not coming to you all the time. And in a lot of cases, a sales manager is different from the account manager. So the account manager might be consistently servicing that client versus, oh, I just sold them on it. Now I'm going to hand it off to somebody else. So, it takes different types of capabilities to really get those things to work.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, isn't it, about kind of the short-term relationship versus the long-term. And I wonder as well whether there's, and I guess the same could apply to the sports example as well. It's transitioning from like this hyper-competitive environment into one where you're expected to be very collaborative and supportive and work with people instead of against them. One other thing I'm going to pick up on that you said, where part of leadership is innate and part of it is learned. Now, in the sports example, where there's literally it's physical performance, I can see that, genetics are going to play a role. Now, I'm not sure I agree with you about innate parts that are there on leadership, because to me, it is a learned skill. It's something you're made, not born. There's the cliche from social media. So what aspects of it, of leadership in particular, do you feel are kind of natural talents, and which bits are the bits you can learn?
So some of it is, some of those learned bits are sometimes about matching leadership prototypes. So different cultures have different prototypes for what a good leader should look like. So for example, in the United States, generally speaking, you need extroverted leaders. You need, leaders that are ready to talk, ready to kind of schmooze. That's our expectation of what a leader should look like. They also have to be maybe sort of down to earth. There's a cliche in American politics about presidents that the president needs to be somebody that you want to get a beer with. I don't know how that relates to presidential performance, but apparently that's part of it. And so people have different levels of likability and different levels of comfort with being extroverted or, being somebody who is, a planner or ready to communicate. So some of that is personality based. So some people feel really comfortable with, in social situations. Some people are much more extroverted, and so they're perceived as leaders more. Other elements of leadership that we might think of as innate are just things like organizational capabilities. So a big part of being a leader is keeping work organized. If you yourself are not naturally geared to being really organized, that can be very difficult. So I think that's one of those things that, that people vary on in skill. Can you get better from leadership development? Sure. I think you can learn. There might be a ceiling to your level of achievement in leadership, right? Like, oh, I'm highly disorganized and I go through leadership training. I learn how to be much more organized, how to organize other people's work and how to organize mine. But somebody who has maybe a little bit more natural ability at that may exceed your capability in that if you're limited in that way. I don't want people to think that no one, that there are people that like can never become leaders, because I don't think that's necessarily true. The other thing that's interesting in leadership, and we see this a lot in leadership research, there's a concept called leadership emergence. So there's some people that really, they don't want a leadership role at all. And if they don't want to be a leader, it's like impossible to get them to lead other people. And I think that's really a tough thing for some people to do, because they're like, I don't want to be in charge of other people. I hated group projects in school. I refuse to do that. I will work as hard as possible. Somebody else needs to like run interference and deal with all the other stuff that I personally don't want to deal with. And one thing I've seen in organizations, sometimes organizations like ignore that request from a leader, like a top performer, like an engineer that basically says like, leave me alone. I want to just code. I literally was dealing with this a couple of weeks ago where we were dealing with an engineering company, And there was a coder who, excellent coder. Everybody that I talked to said he's literally the best coder, but they had him like mentoring other coders or giving them, trying to get them to work better together. And he himself was like, I don't like doing this. This is a waste of my time. I should just be working on my code and not worrying about dealing with these leadership issues. Give that to somebody else who wants to deal with that.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. And again, it speaks back to the kind of the accidental manager a little bit as well. And then there's that whole when you tie the paycheck to it as well, which again, and this comes up quite a lot on the podcast actually, is this problem of people want to progress in their career. They want to start earning more money. And in a lot of organizations, maybe the majority even, the only way to do that is to accept leadership in some form. Even if you don't want to do it, you don't feel like you're right for it. You're not very good at it, whatever reasoning is going around in people's minds. And then you get stuck in that and you're doing something you don't want to do, that you don't enjoy, you don't feel you're very good at. And you're not going to learn to be better at it because you don't enjoy it. And it's that vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, in the American version of The Office, we see a really good example of that where, Michael Scott is a great salesperson, but a horrible manager. He could become a good manager if he paid attention to his leadership training at all, but he's like really phenomenal individual contributor, should probably stay in that individual contributor role. And that actually is a issue in a lot of organizations, is that structurally they only want to provide you with a certain salary increase if you've got a team under you. Then they've said, well, then you're worth it. But in reality, you should probably create like an individual contributor, technical leader track to compensate for that, and another track where people are people managers. That way, you're really like bringing the best folks together for that type of role. Kind of going back to that sports analogy, if you look at some of the best coaches, a lot of the best coaches are people that like could not perform, the sport itself. They weren't the best performer, right? Like, if you look at any, basketball, soccer, things like that, they're not the number one person, but they know the game, they understand how the game works, and they can put people in the right place. Whereas another player who, is naturally more talented, they can't articulate how they know where to be in the right spot, but somebody else can watch them and understand that logic. So I think that's really important to consider.
It's differing skill sets, isn't it? And I think that's one of the real powerful things of effective leadership, is that you can acknowledge what you're good at and what you're not. And then you find other people who are good at the things you're not good at. And, together you form this whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. I love the Michael Scott example as well. One of my favorite episodes is where he realizes he can make more money as a salesperson. And so he steps away from the management job.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, oh, wow, Michael, you're doing, it's such a great thing. You're being so magnanimous and you're releasing power. And so, yeah, I'm great. Yeah, but he's doing it for the money, really. Quite a funny one. Anyway. Yeah. What would you say then are the top three things that any leader or manager could learn from pop culture leaders and then apply to their day-to-day leadership?
So I thought about this a lot, and I think the number one thing that a leader can learn from like watching and engaging with pop culture is probably how to manage relationships. A lot of times when we think about managing relationships, and especially in my like executive coaching work, I see this a lot where a manager or leader will say something like, well, what does that look like? And I'll be like, well, you need to communicate more clearly. Well, okay, what does that look like? And you can use examples in pop culture to kind of illustrate that. So, for example, at the end of the Avengers movie, when Captain America is giving instructions, he has very clear instructions about what he wants every person to do, what he wants everybody in his team to do, and then he has these clear follow-ups. And so that helps, for leaders to see like, oh yeah, I can totally see this. I can totally understand, how this might work. I think the second big thing that leaders can take away from popular culture is that they can learn to kind of avoid mistakes. And you can see this a lot where, for example, in Captain America Civil War, the conflict between Captain America and Iron Man, one of the criticisms that comes up in like social media and in the fan base is, well, if they just talk to each other, if Captain America and Iron Man just talk to each other, they'd be able to figure it out. And I'm like, yes, but then you wouldn't have a movie. So you need to, I need the fight scene before they talk it out. So that they can do it. But that's the thing. You can see, that they're not talking to each other and they're avoiding the real issue that they have. And everyone can very clearly see that there's a, some beef happening and that there's this issue and they're both avoiding it. They're both avoiding the real conversation. But it's so easy for a leader to say that and say, oh, yeah, they're not really talking about it. Well, what's the conversation you're avoiding with your subordinate? What's the conversation that you should be having about a conflict that's bubbling under the surface? Can you then see that and then, say, okay, I need to have that conversation. And so it's really a great way to kind of have that sounding board where a leader can watch that and they can say, well, okay, I don't want to fall into this situation of a conflict that can't be resolved. So I need to really reflect on it and think about it. And I find that like movies and pop culture are really helpful in that regard. My co-author and I, are working on another. We have another book in this series coming out about a TV show called Avatar: The Last Airbender. There are a couple of really good examples of dealing with things like conflict. I think third thing that I think leaders can really learn a lot about. This might be particular to U.S. context, but leaders are very stressed out. And I think sometimes in my experience in a United States context is that they're very bad about finding ways to manage their own stress. But they can watch a movie and they can say, this person is very stressed out. This person is exhausted. They need a break. And then you can say, well, there's somebody else who might need a break as well, or somebody else who needs to maybe delegate a little more as well. And so, when Gordon and I were writing our Avatar: The Last Airbender book, there's a character named Zuko, who is kind of the bad guy for the beginning part of the show, but he has his own leadership journey. He's a prince. He has a very adversarial relationship with everybody that he is working with. He's got some trauma that he has to deal with, but he doesn't like working with a lot of the people that are on his team. And he has to kind of be mentored to say, like, no, you can't just yell at everybody just because you're royalty and expect everybody to do things. You have to actually like articulate things and communicate with them and build those relationships, because they can drop you. They don't, even though they quote unquote have to follow you, they can still not do work the way that you expect. They can betray you at some point. And so there's a big process of learning in that type of a setting.
Those are three great lessons, I have to say. I like the second one in particular, that whole conflict management thing. I mean, I've seen it a few times. I've worked for bosses who've done that, where so often, like, you make that conflict worse by avoiding it. If you just have the difficult conversation, 5-10 minutes, half an hour, even that, and it's over. But so many people they don't want to face it. They're worried about the conflict. They're worried about, I don't know, someone might quit if you have an argument with them, something like that. So they just put it off and they put it off and they put it off. They don't realize that every time they put it off, they're probably doubling the severity of the problem. And if they just dealt with it at the beginning, it wouldn't have been an issue. So one I've seen a couple of times now where someone wants a pay rise and the manager knows that's what they want to talk about. So they avoid the conversation. They're always busy. They've always double booked, or they don't show up to the office for 3 weeks or something like that. And what happens is that then festers, and the person who wants the pay rise realizes, I'm probably not getting the pay rise. Why can't they just tell me? And they start looking for another job. Whereas if you just said from the beginning that, really sorry, we can't do it right now because of these reasons. However, this is my plan for the future to get you there. Problem solved at the beginning, or at least less ill feeling. They might still go somewhere else if money's the main motivator, but at least they're doing it on good terms instead of toxic and negative and horrible ones.
Yeah, absolutely. That compensation conversation is very difficult. It's always hard. Nobody ever likes how much they're getting paid. Even the highest paid, like, sports star, it's like, I'm probably worth a little more than what I'm being paid. I know I'm number one across the world, but I could, you could throw me a few more bucks and I'd be happy, right? So I think that's really important, especially, and it's uncomfortable to have those conversations. I think it's also sometimes what happens, especially if you have a star performer and there's conflict on the team, that's also a really difficult conversation to have. So, there's so many trainings that we do around crucial conversations or difficult conversations. How do you have them? How do you approach the subject? How do you try to be sensitive around those things? So that's a big part of what we do.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the pay one is just an example to prove the point, but you're right. It's perhaps one of the most contentious ones, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I do feel like, though, like step one has to be like, don't avoid the conversation.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Anyway, yeah. And yeah, I mean, your third one as well, the whole like the raised voice, and yeah, just don't do that. Like, there's no good outcome to doing that. I don't understand why so many people do it. It's just bad at dealing with the frustrations. And I do think there's quite a lot of leaders and managers who actually, are ignoring the voice raising part of it, but more the kind of the self-regulation and dealing with your own stress. There are so many people in those roles who it's actually coming from a place of selflessness because they're taking on too much work. They're trying to help the team or support their people, and they're burning themselves out. And they think in their mind that it's, that's just my job. I'm doing it to help people. And it's coming from a good place, actually, which is often not acknowledged. But I think what they're perhaps missing in that scenario is what's the example you're setting? Because you're showing people that you maybe don't want them to take a break and de-stress every now and then because you're not doing it for yourself. And that, I think, is, once you get to that realization, that just changes everything overnight, doesn't it?
Yeah. And well, one thing we know from parenting is like people pick up whatever you do more than what you say. So it's really important to kind of model the behavior that you expect people to engage in versus the behavior that you don't want them to do. Like I have a toddler and an infant at home now, and I see that with my son where he'll do things that I do that I never intended him to like follow or to do, just because he's seen me do it. So that's a really important, consideration. And people, they take the signals from their managers. So if you, set a tone where, for example, I've seen this in a bullying context where a manager is a bully and then other employees, have this sort of relationship with others, which is kind of a bullying relationship. So you have to look at what the culture is like that the leader has established. And if the leader has established a culture where, it's okay if you quote unquote razz somebody about their work or, do something like that because we all think it's funny, but that doesn't necessarily lead to a better, healthier workplace environment.
Yeah, it is difficult, isn't it? Because you're relying on everyone else to interpret the relationship in the same way that you are. Because you might know that person like really well. You might have known them for 20 years or something, but not everyone else in the room is going to necessarily make that connection as well. And you're right. It does get into bullying so easily if you're not really careful, or just don't do it in the first place. The parental comparison's interesting. I don't know why. But what popped into my head was that kind of reversal when you get to adulthood of nagging your parents about something, like going to the doctor, for example, and the link to the manager who's under stress and won't do anything about it. Maybe employees should be nagging their managers, like, you're stressed, take a break.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things we talk about in our leadership books is a lot of times employees imagine that if they don't have the title of manager, right, that, I'm not really in charge of anything. I don't have the job title, but people lead in a variety of different ways. There are reasons that people might follow you versus somebody else. Like you might have some knowledge that another employee doesn't. You might be just respected in the organization. You've been there for a really long time. People know you. And so the way that we've defined leadership is that it's a social influence process. So it's about making any kind of change. So even if you're a subordinate to another leader, you can you can lead that person. You can lead your manager too. You can influence them to make change happen. It may not always be, a rise in compensation, but it might be a change that is, that makes things better for you in your workplace.
Yeah. And I think, I like to think, I don't know, maybe I'm biased by this, but I like to think like in the long term, it will have that impact because if you're if you're leading from that sort of place, and it is about influence, which takes many different forms as well. It's not just about having the title, as you say, and using influence in that kind of more overt way. But if you're having positive influence and you're influencing change in the right ways over the long term, maybe even the medium term, the organisation gets better. And you have to believe if the organisation gets better, then the revenue goes up, because otherwise why are we even doing any of this in the first place? And so when the revenue goes up, likely as not, I think, if you've got a good leader, they're going to notice the influence and the impact you've had, contribution you've made. And so, sooner or later, the money will come your way anyway. I like to believe.
You hope so. You hope that if the other parts of the business are sound, that if you just do the work that's there, you can organize it well and get everybody on board, that the business will be successful over time, or the organization is going to be successful by whatever metrics you're using.
Yeah, maybe it's a bit idealistic to think that because the business does better, everyone within it will do better, but who knows? Financially, at least.
Financially,
Awesome.
Is there any other metric that we can use to feel better, in the world of business? Probably not.
Perhaps not from the sort of the business owner's point of view, but I think from the employee's point of view, there are other metrics, aren't there? But I guess if you get to that point and you feel like you're doing all the right things and you are leading from below, as it were, and you still don't see the reward and the remuneration that you feel you're worth, then that's a decision point, isn't it? And at least and you're informed now, and you can go and find a different organization that would treat you better.
That's true. And there has been a push among some human capital consultants in the US, at least, to kind of expand what good organizational performance looks like beyond just financial metrics. Like, you could have a very successful company, but be grinding out employees left and right. We see that sometimes in the US in financial type jobs where, you have very high payouts, but the cost in terms of work-life balance, in terms of stress, is quite high. And so there's been a little bit of a push to say, well, maybe we should look more holistically at how people are working. And does it create, is the organization creating a situation where workers are treated fairly, correctly, but they're also, being remunerated, maybe not at the highest level, but maybe at a level that makes sense.
There's something to be said as well about kind of the relative remuneration as well between and where the contributions are really being made, and that whole piece. There's that guy quite far, is he in the States or Canada, but I can't remember his name either, but he was on LinkedIn a couple of years ago and made a lot of noise, made a big splash about it. He put everyone in the company on the same salary. I think they were all taking $70K.
Yeah, that's Dan Price, I think is his name.
That's the guy. Yeah. And that felt, I don't know. I'd love to know what's happened since then, because that was a few years back. Is the business still going? Is everyone still paid the same? And how did it work? What difference did it make? Did turnover go up or down in terms of people? Or
I actually think his company is still pretty successful. He got into some personal issues, if I remember correctly. There was some, I think maybe Me Too type stuff for him personally that came out, which was unfortunate. But generally his idea of just, fairly compensating people a little bit above market rate, and retaining employees, and not just saying okay, we're going to go for the biggest profit of all time. That idea is, I think, very powerful. It's also true that in a lot of contexts, there are business practices that are engaged in that really don't lead to better business. So, for example, in the United States, we're seeing layoffs happen, but in general, layoffs they don't save money. They don't make the organization better. They're very much a short-term, P&L kind of win. So you're just, getting rid of staff, but every process within the organization suffers because you engage in that. There's no data that shows that layoffs lead to overall better performance in the long run. But you can't meet a business executive that isn't ready to hit the layoff button at the drop of a hat. Even though the evidence is there and it's hey, we don't know if this is really going to make your organization better. we've seen some organizations that just say, no, we're not going to lay staff off, and they're able to weather the storm. Maybe they don't perform as well for a short period of time, but they're able to, get more out of that staff in the long run. And so I think there's something to be said about how leaders and managers make decisions, and how much of that is just driven by short-term financial realities.
Yeah, it's always felt like a bit of a false logic to me. I guess it depends on the organization, doesn't it? Like if they've spent 2 years hiring above market rate and they've built a team that's 4 times the size than what they actually need to achieve their objectives, then that's one thing. But if they've just been paying at slightly above market rate to attract the best talent, they've got a functioning team who are delivering on what needs to be delivered on, whatever that is, and then it's just a cost-cutting measure because they're running out of money. That has always felt like false logic, because if you get rid of a team that's working and delivering for you, even if you save money, which potentially you won't because of the cost of having to replace them later, you're losing the people who are doing the performing. So of course performance is going to go down, isn't it? Like that's just, there's a very clear causation there, and I've never understood that. It just feels like a panic measure, doesn't it? Like we're running out of money. What costs the most? Is people, right? Let's get rid of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see that now, like, for example, a company like Disney, which is like one of the biggest companies in the world. They pretty much own my entire childhood. Then, they own like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They have all this stuff. They engaged in layoffs, right? And mostly they were theme park employees, but like the theme park doesn't function without those employees, right? Like that, literally the service doesn't exist without those employees. So what is the goal there? And that, I guess, is to satisfy shareholders. People who own shares in the company, if they hear that they're cost cutting measures, usually that's something that's seen as a positive, and that's seen as something that's good. Oh, they're just, cutting all these, unnecessary jobs that they didn't need to have. But in reality, they do need them. In order for the company to work, they do need them. And maybe if organizations want to take a different perspective on their human resource strategy, where maybe they're saying, oh, we added too many people in a particular area, maybe we need to be more strategic, maybe we need to shift people into a different spot in the organization, that I would understand. But usually it's just mass layoffs. Like my father was a biochemist in the pharmaceutical industry in the United States for a long time, and anytime the financial returns weren't exactly what shareholders wanted, the first people to go out the door were the scientists. Like, oh, we got to cut scientists like every few years. But the scientists are like the ones that are making the medications that you're trying to sell. Without them, I don't know what you have. Like, you can market the drugs that you have, but you need new drugs, new innovations, and you're going to cycle through and hire people back eventually. So getting rid of them now doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense.
Maybe I'm cynical about it all, but it is quite easy to look at it and wonder like how much self-interest is playing a role in these decisions as well. Because you see it in banking and in the couple of credit crunches and economic issues we've had. You see it in the tech world, where suddenly the money's running out, so they lay off the people who are doing the work, and yet the leaders always stay. They usually keep their 6-figure salaries. They maintain their office, even if they're in an industry where it could all be done remotely and they don't need a premises, but they're still forking out 6 figures a month on that. And you're just like, well, this is a question of priorities, isn't it? Because if you're really trying to save costs, you go for the things that aren't bringing you money in, surely, and keep the people who are, which is the people doing all the work. And maybe, if you're in a founder-led business and you own that company, maybe give yourself a pay cut before you fire someone. But and to be fair, a lot of them do. But at the same time, there's others who don't. It's the most difficult thing I've ever had to do. And you see like the teary-eyed sort of false posts on social media, and you're like, yeah, but you're still drawing a big paycheck, aren't you? So hard for me to feel sorry for you in this situation, to be honest.
It's true. Like, well, even executives they never give the golden parachute, especially in the United States. When an executive leaves, they're leaving with a ton of money, no matter what, whether the organization performed, it didn't perform. That's always the case. And so, I do feel that a lot of leaders, they can be motivated by stock price, by their own stock options and what they might get out of the organization, rather than, well, how do I sustain this company? How do I make sure the company functions the way that I expect? And so there's a lot of different elements to that when we think about leadership, and that's where a lot of leadership goals are there. Like, what is the leader's individual goal? Is it is it a personal self-serving goal? Is it one related to the overall organization's mission? We see a lot of that in the United States, is that there may be some conflicts in terms of the goals that the leader has.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the most stunning examples of it, at least in the UK, were back in sort of the aftermath of 2008 and the credit crunch, when there were banks getting bailed out by the government, and then CEOs still walking away with that golden parachute, and shocking stuff. I mean, in hindsight, you're just like, how was that allowed to happen?
Yeah.
But anyway, let's not dwell on the negative side of it. So maybe a difficult question for you, because you've probably got so many to choose from, but what would you say is the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned in your whole career so far?
The biggest leadership lesson that I've learned is really about clear communication and kind of tracking and accountability. So as a leader, you have to be able to communicate clearly. You have to be really explicit about what you want. I would actually say that if you are in your career, if you have like an explicit desire to do something, I want to manage, I want to be a technical leader, I think it's important to be explicit about that. And I don't mean, explicit in the sense of like, I must become a leader, you have to give me this role. I mean, just by being clear with people, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to accomplish. Because I think a lot of times leaders don't know, right? Sometimes I think subordinates especially, you think to yourself like, my leader definitely, I had a conversation with my manager, he knows what I want to do. Your manager's not thinking about you all the time and about your career goals. Sadly, like you're not the main character in his or her story. Like you're one of the supporting players, so you have to be like really explicit, and then you have to look for those opportunities. For a leader, I think it's really important for them to be clear about what it is that they want, what it is, what the goals of the team are, what the individual's goals are, and then to track that. I think leaders are really good often about saying like, here's what the organization needs, here's what I need, but they sometimes don't do a great job of checking in and seeing like, yes, this is what we need to track, and I'm going to follow up with you. A lot of times, we were talking about salespeople before. A lot of times people look at like solely outcomes. They're like, well, sales aren't up. Why can't you sell more? Well, there's a whole downstream set of things that happen before a sale occurs. Is the employee looking at, are they following up with enough leads? Are they generating enough leads? Is your organization generating enough leads for the salesperson to actually do the work? If they're following up, what does the follow-up look like? Are they able to do all of those things? And so rather than just saying, well, why are your sales so bad? Just looking at that outcome, you sometimes have to look at, well, what are the metrics that came before? What are the things that I need to do before? And that's a question of coaching. And sometimes leaders don't know how to coach, and they can learn. They can certainly learn, but they have to like think about it and consider that. But I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that happen, is that they, just assume, well, I said it once and they're going to do it. That's not really how it works. I've been married for a long time now. My wife can tell me one thing one time. I definitely do not remember it right away. She does have to give me reminders. And so, if the person that you're living with at home has to give you reminders at work, you definitely have to be able to give reminders and communicate that and make sure that that's really explicit and clear.
Absolutely. And I think you've hit there on why it's so important to have a good process in place for personal development. Because again, I think there's quite a lot of managers or leaders who don't realize until too late that that's part of your role. Like, it's not just about telling people what to do, it's about helping them develop their skills and achieve their goals and whatever you can do to support that. And yeah, when things are going well, that might mean investing in training for them. When things aren't going so well, maybe there's something else you can do instead. But the important thing is to keep that process going and have those regular intervals, as you say. So yeah, really important lesson. Thank you. I like that one.
Just a lot of I met a lot of managers that really didn't know what to do, and that's just from having a lot of conversations and being really explicit with them about how they could improve.
Yeah, it says a lot about who their managers were as well before they got that job, doesn't it?
No, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. What would you say has been your own best experience of being led?
I think this will be a surprising example, mostly because I think people have like a lot of negative experiences in this. But I did a master's and a PhD, and when I was doing my master's thesis, my advisor for my master's thesis, a woman named Dr. Diane Wentworth. She's really wonderful manager. She had a lot of experience working as a human capital consultant before she became a professor. She was really one of the best leaders that I had, and one of the best managers I had, just because she was really clear with me about what I had to do. She did regular check-ins. So like all the stuff that we talk about in leadership development, right? All of those things, she just did them. Right? Like, oh, you're supposed to have regular check-ins where you actually evaluate work. Okay. You give tough feedback if tough feedback needs to be given, but you don't give it in such a way so as to destroy the hopes and dreams of the person that you're giving feedback to. She did all of that. And she was really clear. She was, she also did something for me, which was she organized the work for me in a way that helped. So not just saying, well, go do it, but also looking at my process and saying, well, okay, here are things that you can do. Here's ways that you can improve. So a lot of times, and I don't know if you've noticed this in the world of leadership, there's always like these fads that come up. There's new technique, new management theory, whatever it happens to be. But I think a lot of the basic stuff doesn't change, right? A lot of the basic stuff doesn't change around communication, around, work structure, around giving feedback, around giving rewards and things like that, and building relationships. And she knew about all of those things. And it was funny, as I was being mentored through my master's thesis, I was like, oh, she's giving me feedback. She's following, this process. She was like, oh, she's giving me a goal. It's a SMART goal. It's specific. It's measurable. It's attainable. It's relevant to what I'm doing, and it's time bound. Right. And so knowing that your manager is kind of telling you those things and communicating them and illustrating it in that way is very helpful, because that changes things for you. And then you say, oh, okay, so now all I have to do is I just got to take this stuff that I read about, and then I just have to commit to it and make sure that I'm doing those things. And that was like, very eye-opening thing for me, that, the stuff that I'm talking about in theory, it was actually helpful and actually working.
Yeah, that is an interesting example, and I think you're right in terms of a lot of people having bad experiences there. I think I was very fortunate, like you, on my master's, to have someone very similar to that who was very supportive. But thinking back to my undergrad and dissertation support there, like, it didn't help that my initial advisor left the university like a month after I started writing, and I don't think I ever met the replacement. So. But yeah, it is shocking, isn't it? I guess that's the world of academia, though.
Academia is a weird place. It's full of like some characters who may or may not know how to manage or give feedback or help students or guide them. And so it was just like a stroke of luck that my master's thesis advisor and my PhD advisor, two really excellent women that provided me with really great support and great ideas, and really followed through on what it takes to be a good leader and a good manager. So that was like the biggest thing for me, was, oh wow, I can really learn how to do this. I can really, I just have to follow the instructions that I'm given, and if I do the things that they're asking me to do, I'm going to see success. I think it's also one of the reasons that it worked for me in both of those examples is the work was really clear. I think sometimes organizations and managers especially, they either don't know what the work should look like, or they're not clear about what's driving business success, right? And I think companies a lot of times they just need to know what is it that's making something successful. What is it that you're able to do? And when I talk to business leaders about strategy and about, what is it that's going to make your business successful? A lot of times leaders want to say everything, right? They're like, well, everything is going to drive this business. I'm like, everything does not drive this business. When I talk with students about it, for example, there's a company in the United States called Walmart that offers kind of like low cost, or what's referred to as a big box store. They offer a lot of different products, and students will say, well, Walmart definitely cares about customer service. Okay, sure, they care about customer service, but what do they care about more, customer service or low cost? And they'll say, well, low cost. I'm like, well, if you look at the decisions they make, everything they do is driven by low costs because they know that's why people go there. Customers go there because they're saving money. They don't need like all of the frills of a fancy department store. That's not why they're going. That's why the experience of going to the store is maybe not the most pleasant, but you're going there because I'm saving on every item. I trust that I'm getting the lowest possible price. That's what I care about. That's what I'm going to do. I see that as well with, I think this exists in the UK. There's a company called Aldi. It's like a grocery store. In the United States, they are like, not the cheapest grocery store, but they definitely are winning on price, more than other grocery stores. And they do a lot of things that other grocery stores take for granted. So for example, they don't provide bags. They've never provided bags. They've been around in the United States for like 20 plus years. They've never provided bags, shopping bags. You have to like put in a quarter to get to get a cart, which you don't have to do in almost any other grocery store in the United States. But if you go there, you know that you're getting as low a price as possible on the groceries that you're getting. Most of them are relatively good quality, and you're just willing to accept that as cost cutting measures for in exchange for those prices.
It's know your customer in the same way for a leader as it is know your people, I suppose. Interesting about the grocery stores though. So yeah, pretty much all of the ones in the UK you have to put in. It's £1 as well, not a quarter. So quite a lot. You get it back though as long as you return the shopping cart. So I think that's what it's about here. But
not common in the United States. United States, I want my cart, and then I just want to leave it wherever I want.
yeah. I guess we just like our tidy car parks here. I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah. Interesting though. Okay, only a couple more questions for you. They're quite difficult ones, I think, though. So we'll start with the time travel one. So if you were doing your own time heist, like in Avengers Endgame, how far back in your own lifetime would you go? And what would you say to your younger self, assuming you could do it without causing a paradox?
Yeah, I don't want to back to the future myself. That would not go well. I think one of the things, especially for me, transitioning from like high school into university, college life, was challenging. And I think one of the things I would have told myself, and this is something I tell a lot of leaders and a lot of people in terms of their careers, is to really trust yourself. Is to trust yourself in terms of like where you see your career going, what you might want to do in the future. Because like I had this idea that I was going to go into like medical school and I was going to become a doctor, and that didn't happen. I changed career paths. I switched careers in college. I was like, this is not. I ended up like doing an internship at a hospital, and I didn't really love it. And I was like, this is not going to work out for me. I don't think this is a good approach for my life. And so I think if I had considered it or thought about it more in maybe high school, I maybe would have said earlier that, maybe, medical school is not the right thing for me. And I would have made the change earlier than I did. So that would be the thing I would go back and I would kind of tell myself, like, you should be honest with yourself. Like, maybe you like the science of this, but do you actually like treating patients? Do you like being in a hospital setting, which I definitely did not enjoy? So I think those are things that I had to consider, and I had to think about, well, how committed am I to this career? And I think that's something that people, especially, I think that's part of the reason that I became, a university professor in addition to, doing this consulting work, is like, I wanted to make sure that students had somebody that was there to tell them, well, maybe you should trust your own instincts and be open about what it is that you want. I have, this is not really a point of pride, but I think that I've given a lot of students a realistic preview of what a PhD looks like, because a lot of students come to me and they're like, "Oh, I definitely want to do a PhD," and I'm like, "Do you really want to do that? That seems like a terrible choice for you. Why don't you think about this? Here's all the things you have to do in order to achieve this. Is it something that you want?" And for a lot of those students, they imagine that there's a huge salary spike with the increased education, and it really isn't there. And so once I tell them that, they're like, "Oh, you mean you're not the highest paid person, even though you have a ton of education?" I'm like, no, definitely not. There's other things I could have done for way more money and save time on on the education. You really have to be passionate about the education and about the science in order to do this. And I think that's like a really important element of, being honest with yourself about it. And I force students to be more honest about what is it you really want. Do you want to do the work and make the money, or do you want to pursue this other thing? And they're like, I think money is nice. And so go get a job. Like, all right, that seems good.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's quite unusual, particularly at that younger age, to have that sort of self-awareness to make that sort of decision. Because I think quite a lot of us, once we get to the university, it's all right, the decision's made now, I'm seeing this through, whatever happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and understandably with how much it costs, I guess. But then that's an argument for both sides, isn't it?
Leadership heroes.
Last question, my favourite question though. You may have already given away the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So it's called Leadership Heroes. If you had to pick one person, they could be anyone you like, alive or dead, past or present, real or fictional, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership. Who would that person be and why?
So I gave away one answer with the Black Panther, who I think embodies really great leadership in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I was thinking about who really that concept of perfect leadership is the thing that I got caught on. And a very American answer would be Abraham Lincoln, who, if you haven't seen the movie Lincoln, directed by Steven Spielberg, it's a really good example of what political leadership looks like and how dirty it is, and how much of it is horse trading and haggling between people. But I don't think he showed perfect leadership. There's a character in Avatar: The Last Airbender. So our next book with Gordon, the next book that I wrote with Gordon is about Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's called Elements of Leadership, Leadership Lessons from Avatar: The Last Airbender, coming out in November. There's a character in that show that I think does a really great job of being a very powerful leader, and that character's name is Uncle Iroh, and he is a really great mentor. And he does something that I think a lot of leaders try to do, and they aren't always that successful at it. And that is that he is able to build relationships with people very, very quickly. So he really listens to a lot of the characters. He's very patient with a lot of the characters in the show. He's able to provide really clear advice to characters that guides them and guides their decision making. And he's able to both focus on the task that needs to be done and then also the social relationship element of it. He specifically mentors another character that has gone through enormous amounts of trauma and is able to guide that character very effectively. And I mentioned him earlier, Prince Zuko. And I think that's a really, really good version of somebody who kind of embodies, when we talk about that phrase, perfect leadership, he has the patience and he has he's kind of my aspirational goals in terms of what I want to be, because I definitely don't have the patience a lot of the time. That's where I have the limitation. Is I'm like, all right, I literally just told you this. Do I need to remind you again about this? Like, okay, let me try it again. And having that patience is, I think, very, very important when it comes to helping people to develop over time. Because a lot of times, when we think about leadership development, we think it's like a straight line. Like, oh, they went to the leadership training, they're going to do really well. And it's really, from my experience watching leaders develop and change and grow, it's more stopping and starting, right? Like they learn a few things, they take a few steps forward, they stumble a little bit, they come back, they get better. So it's more peaks and valleys in that development process. And having the patience to kind of get through those rough patches for those leaders is, I think, really, really challenging and a tough thing to do. And I've always thought, like, wow, if I could just be more like this character, I'd be better at this job.
Which is what makes it such a great choice, I think. I must confess, I haven't seen the show. Is this the new one on Netflix you're talking about?
So the Netflix show, the Netflix show is based on a cartoon from the early 2000s. So the cartoon is what I suggested that people watch. Mostly, obviously, as a serious adult, obviously I'm going to recommend that people watch the cartoon. But the cartoon works really well, and it's the episodes, especially if you're thinking about doing leadership coaching and you have a leader who doesn't have the time to read an entire book or watch an entire movie. Episodes are 22 minutes long. You can have them watch a particular episode or even a series of episodes and see how characters change, how they develop over time, how, different characters mentor one another. I think that's really valuable. And especially, like, I don't know if it's like this in the UK, but there is some resistance for leaders to say, like, I have too much to read. I have too much to do, to do this. I can't read this leadership book that you want me to read. I don't have time to, like, just go to this session or, things like that. But if you tell them, oh, we've got 22 minute episode, can you give me 20 minutes? They can usually do it. And if you frame it as, here's this, like, low energy, rather low mental energy thing that will also be engaging, they'll engage with that, and they'll say, well, okay, I can take my mind off whatever I'm doing, I can watch this, and then we'll come back and talk about it. And so I think that's a really important tool in the process of them thinking about what leadership looks like. And once again, just because it's animation doesn't mean that it's not something that people can engage with. I think over the last, like, 30 years or so, especially with the rise of, like, Japanese animation, I think people's attitudes about what animation can be and, how to engage with it, I think is really different. And it presents an opportunity for leadership development pros to say, oh, I can use this, and people will watch it and they'll want to, engage with it rather than just being like, oh, this seems silly.
I mean, animation generally, and shows like Family Guy, I guess, have made it a bit more acceptable for adults to watch cartoons. Absolutely. Definitely not recommending Family Guy for leadership development, though. That would be a bad idea.
I mean, there might be some Simpsons episodes that you could get away with.
True. Yeah. I mean, especially some of the earlier ones with like Homer's role at the nuclear plant and things like that. I'm sure there's some management lessons in there.
Sure. Or, some episodes with Lisa, there's definitely stuff out there. So, in any pop culture that you're planning on using, you always have to test the appetite of the audience, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I've been in organizations that are, like, kind of old school, conservative. And if I roll into that organization, I'm like, let's talk about Spider-Man, I'm just going to get laughed out of the room. So I have to, like, pick and choose my battles with that.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, sorry. So I'm slightly conscious of using too much of your time. So I think we better bring it to a close there. But it's been a really interesting conversation. We've gone in all sorts of different directions that I wasn't expecting. The pop culture thing is so interesting to me, especially from the nerdy angle, which is where I live and breathe really as well. So yeah, thank you so much for a great conversation. And if anyone in the audience wants to learn more about what you do, maybe get a copy of one or two of those books, where can they go to do so?
So the books are available wherever you buy books. They might even be in your local library, which I'm a big fan of. Feel free to get it from the library. But Amazon has both books. Leaders Assemble is available right now. Elements of Leadership is available for pre-order, so you can find it there.
Wonderful. Well, I'll dig out some links as well and put them in the episode description so people can find it easily. And yeah, that's it. That's pretty much all we've got time for. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Great to be here. And if anybody wants to find me, I'm available on LinkedIn and on Twitter. And I'm happy to talk about this stuff.
Awesome. Thank you again, Si, for a great discussion there. Certainly a new take on leadership and a useful perspective too, I think. Thanks for listening or watching if you're with us on YouTube. If you would like to learn more about Si, his company, or his books, you'll find the links in the episode description below. And as I say every week, do please click on those and go and find out more and support his work if you can. If you are a new leader, a first-time company founder or co-founder, or a manager in training, and you'd like to be more effective in your role, better respected by the people you lead, and you're looking for a supportive group atmosphere where you can learn about leadership in a safe space, then do come and join our online community of leaders just like you. It's called Integrity Leaders. It's a community membership and learning space for new leaders or first-time founders. You can participate in live workshops and learning events, benefit from extra and exclusive content, and get early access to Leading with Integrity podcast episodes. So head over to www.leadernotaboss.com to register today. And as a podcast listener, you can benefit from a 50% discount for the duration of your membership. Just type in the promo code in the relevant box. It is half off, all capitals, numbers 24. So half off 24, all in caps. And I hope to see you in there very soon. That's all for today. I hope you'll join us again next week when I'll be talking to fellow leadership expert and podcaster Thomas Harris about why so many of us get the leadership basics wrong, especially when we're first starting out, the myths and misconceptions involved, and much more besides. So don't miss it. I'll talk to you then. And until next week, I'll be on your left, and be sure to be a leader, not a boss.